Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky, the president there, he's also making a Victory Day announcement, saying soon there's going to be 2 Victory Days in Ukraine. Let me get to Cal Perry in Kyiv. And Cal, we just showed that split screen of President Zelensky in a video message that he has released today. But the backdrop to that is the fighting on the ground and what's happening in Luhansk, this one region where officials think that maybe 60 people are dead after a strike on a school where people had been hiding out. What else do we know?
Yeah, this strike took place on Saturday. Again, as you said, people sheltering in this school. It's a small village in the Luhansk region, which is in the eastern part of the country and takes the brunt of what has been now an 8-year war across the eastern front of this country. We will have to wait on what exactly the death toll there is, because according to local officials, and you're seeing aftermath of that attack there are still Russian troops in the area. They still want to repel those Russian troops. And we should say there is a great counterattack, in the words of Ukrainian officials, taking place in the Kharkiv region. And this is sort of in that area that we see Ukrainian forces fighting back. So much of the country, Hallie, the backdrop to this is so much of this country has been destroyed, and so much of the cleanup continues. So people here are watching so many of these funding bills coming out of Washington, because it's not just military funding that this country needs. It's going to need billions of dollars in rescue aid, in cleanup aid for refugees who have been displaced, for internally displaced persons, and to clean up areas like this. President Biden announcing in just the last hour that this Ukraine supplemental defense bill, which is the next tranche of money, has actually been separated from COVID funding. You know, the U.S. Congress passes things in batches, but separating these two out is going to allow the U.S. Congress to pass this next tranche of aid, and included in that aid is a great deal of money, as I said, for humanitarian work and for cleanup across the country. That is the backdrop to these two speeches, Hal.
And what you just mentioned, Cal, is important as it relates to the domestic politics piece of it in the U.S., because decoupling the COVID money from the Ukraine money basically clears the path, as you well know, for that funding to get to Ukraine. What's interesting is you mentioned something, Cal, that I think is important. You talked about the cleanup that is happening and the destruction. And let me talk about the destruction, because now there's this reporting from Mariupol that Russia is basically destroying, targeting like bridges, right? Targeting some of the infrastructure that got civilians out of that steel plant in Mariupol that had been besieged, with some of those last remaining civilians arriving in safer locations relatively now.
Yeah, and according to an advisor to the mayor, the destruction of those bridges and the attempted destruction of other bridges took place just as those last civilians were evacuating to the city of Zaporizhzhia. Those are the last civilians, we understand, in that Azov plant. The fate of those who remain in the plant, the fighters, those who are wounded, remains very much up in the air as Russian forces continue to assault that plant. But to your point, these infrastructure targets have become the targets that Russia is carrying out in the last week. We saw it on railway bridges, on railway structures. We saw it on power grid in the west, and now, of course, these bridges in Mariupol. The southern cities that are along the Black Sea, Hallie, are getting pounded. Odessa, in just the last hour, has taken a number of missile strikes. We're waiting for officials to tell us what was hit and if there were any casualties. But the fighting clearly continues in that area of the country.
Cal Perry, live for us in Kyiv. Cal, thank you. We got some breaking news on Wall Street back here at home, with this week starting where last week ended, in the red. Sorry, gang, check out the outlook. The Dow down just a little bit under 2%. The S&P, the NASDAQ, all down too. The S&P, by the way, closing below 4,000 for the first time in more than a year. CNBC senior analyst and commentator Ron Insana is joining us now. Ron, you know we love plain English on this show, so plain English is here, right? Why is this stock sell-off still happening?
Well, some of the reasons you just discussed, Hallie. The war in Ukraine is disrupting food and energy supplies around the world. The lockdown in China is extending the problem of delivering goods from China, because about a third of the population is locked in and their supply chains are disrupted. We have inflation that is above target here in the United States, and the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates, possibly in the future triggering a recession, which is what the stock market was most concerned about today.
So what does this mean for, the rest of us, let's say, meaning those of us who aren't in those pictures that are, at the floor of the stock exchange in New York, right? What is the timeline? What is the outlook we should be looking at? Because if you mention these international issues, the COVID lockdowns in China, what's happening in Ukraine, we don't know when those are going to end, right? There's just a lot of uncertainty here, it feels like.
Yeah, and I think no one knows. And I think that's the biggest problem, why the market is chunking down the way it is. You know, it's dropping 2, 3, 4% a day. We get these very alluring 500, 600, 1,000 point rallies, and then we head right back down, as you said, closing at a 52-week low. So I think until we get some clarity around when the Fed's going to stop raising interest rates, when the inflation fever breaks, we get Wednesday the consumer price report, which will tell us more about inflation. And until we know more about China and Ukraine, there are just so many moving parts here that create such a sense of uncertainty that it's hard for the market to find its footing. We are in a bear market, and until something positive happens, we're probably going to go through these days. We will get big rallies, and they'll be very tempting. They'll be very alluring, but I suspect they're going to be bear market rallies, not the start of a new bull market in stocks.
Ron and Sana, thank you for breaking it down as always. And as the stock market gets to those record lows, as we talked about, or at least near to them, those plans and proposals from the G7 and EU about banning Russian oil imports, they're affecting crude oil and gas prices today. And you know this, we're 3 weeks out, if you can believe it, from Memorial Day, and gas prices are already at record highs. And you know what? Again, don't shoot the messenger, but experts say it's probably going to get worse. Check it out on screen. The national average today, $4.33. That's up 14 cents from just last week. That ties the record high set back in March. In places like New Jersey and Michigan, they're up 24 to 27 cents in just a week. Let me bring in Jake Ward now. And Jake, you're at a gas station just south of San Francisco. The cheapest price is $6.19, right? Now, let's also caveat by saying California tends to have higher gas prices than the rest of the country. Perhaps not represent. It's like going to my, the gas station right across from the Capitol here in Washington, which is at like $5. Not all the gas stations in the city are like that, but what does this mean for people who are thinking about, hey, do I cut back on my vacation this summer a little bit? Do I drive a little less?
Well, Hallie, recent polling has shown that very much people do change their travel plans based on this sort of thing. One public opinion poll done by Yahoo and Maru Public Opinion essentially found that the majority of Americans, they were asked about a week and a half ago, if gas prices got to basically where they are right now, would you change your mind? About 66% of people said, yes, we would. The other 34% said that if it hit $5 as a national average, then that's the point at which they would change their plan. So that is everybody. But for some people, it's a much deeper problem than just canceling a vacation plan. I've talked to people at food banks here in the Bay Area who say that their folks that are coming in to get a free weekly shipment of food are in some cases walking in rather than driving, just to save that little extra money, because gas is so expensive here as a percentage of a household income as it is across the nation, Hallie.
Talk about the long-term impact, because we mentioned what's happening with crude oil, and oil prices are actually down a little bit because of what we're seeing internationally, those COVID lockdowns in China, for example. But everything else is up, right? Jet fuel's up, energy costs. I mean, you laid it out. What we pay for gas affects a whole lot more than just what we put in the car, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I mean, whether or not you can afford gas determines the fate of retailers in your neighborhood. One study found that online shopping went up enormously at a time when gas prices were higher because people did not want to drive to the store. That can make or break a retailer. I mean, you're talking about airlines in countries like Nigeria actually threatening to cancel flights because they cannot afford jet fuel. So why is all this happening? Well, it's complicated, of course. There are many factors. One of them is that during COVID, the oil producers shut down some wells and now perhaps are looking at it and saying, maybe we'll put our money into stock dividends, buybacks, rather than opening up wells again. Ukraine, of course, a huge supplier of crude to the rest of the world. That has disrupted global markets. And, you have Shell, the CEO of Shell, saying we had our greatest, most profitable quarter in the history of the company. And he specifically cited Ukraine as one of many factors contributing to that. And so we have many, many things going on here. But certainly we don't see a direct correlation between the price of crude oil, which, as you say, has dropped, and the price of gas where we are right now, which continues to climb and probably will do so through the Memorial Day weekend.
Should we have any hope, though, Jake? We always hear like gas prices are quick to go up and slow to go down. But if oil prices are starting to drop, should we be hopeful that maybe by Labor Day we'll be in a better position?
At this point, it's really not clear that the cause and effect that we're used to and that economists have used for years are going to do it, especially because they know we will pay. We've been pent up. We want to get out. Maybe going into Memorial Day, people are willing to spend more than we thought they would.
Jake Ward, live for us there in California. Jake, thank you. Police in Madison, Wisconsin today, they want the public's help to figure out any tips on who might be responsible for what they're calling an arson attack at a nonprofit that supports anti-abortion measures. Police who responded also found threats spray painted on the walls, saying if abortions are not safe, then you are not either. Today, the Biden administration condemned this attack in a statement, saying Americans have the right to express themselves, but that must be peaceful and free of violence or vandalism or attempts to intimidate. All of this, of course, comes just 1 week after the leak of that Supreme Court opinion draft suggesting a majority of justices are prepared to overturn Roe versus Wade. It's created protests all across the country from both abortion rights advocates, anti-abortion advocates, including on the part of abortion rights activists at the home of some Supreme Court justices. Lawmakers today have now introduced a bipartisan bill that would extend protections from Supreme Court police to the family members of justices. I want to bring in Ron Allen, who's been monitoring what's happened in Madison for us. So it is an active investigation, Ron, but they have no suspects, and now the FBI is getting involved?
And the ATF, yes. And I don't think any of them are surprised by this at all. The other thing that the Madison police said that they're going to do is increase vigilance at other potential targets, if you will, because everyone thinks that this debate is going to get perhaps even more and more passionate as the weeks go by. Remember, everyone is just reacting to a draft, not the actual decision, and there's a lot of emotion. This attack happened at 6 a.m. in the morning, and it was only spotted by a passerby, someone who was driving to the airport nearby, police said. And the other part of it that was fortunate, I guess you could say, is that there was a Molotov cocktail thrown through a window, but it didn't explode. It didn't go off as it would have. So the point is that the damage could have been much worse. There was nobody present at the office at the time, as I understand it. But in fact, what was planned, what was targeted, could have been much, much worse. And again, the Madison police, the FBI, others don't seem surprised that this has happened. Hope, of course, that it doesn't happen, but everybody is, I think, realistic about this, and that's why the police are stepping up patrols and trying to be much more vigilant. There's such a spotlight, obviously, on this issue right now, Ron. When you look at this, you have, as some states are looking to put in place or have put in place trigger laws, for example, that would take immediate action if Roe were to be overturned in restricting abortion access. You have some cities, some states, the New York Attorney General, for example, Letitia James, announcing moves to expand protections along with lawmakers in New York for abortion access. I talked with the mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, who announced today Chicago is going to give funding, basically, if Roe were to be overturned, to help women from nearby states get access to abortions in that city. Let me play a little bit of that conversation. Would $500,000 be enough?
Well, $500,000 is simply a down payment to help our frontline providers get over this immediate hurdle. But they tell us they've already seen an exponential increase in the amount of calls to helplines from out of state, just from what's happened in Texas.
So you're seeing, Ron, what's happening at the federal level, right? What's happening at the state level and what's happening at the local level, too, almost simultaneously.
Exactly, and we seem to be headed towards this division again. It's no big surprise again. Yeah. Red states are moving in one direction, blue states in another, and that seems to be where abortion providers, abortion services could be in the coming months, available in some states and not in others. It'd be interesting to see how some states deal with trying to perhaps prosecute residents or citizens of their own states who go elsewhere for these kinds of services. But again, yes, there are more protests planned. There is a protest plan for this evening outside the Supreme Court Justice Alito's home, I believe it is. And there's more of that to come in the weeks ahead. And again, yes, this issue, perhaps as much as any other, divides the country, and we are seeing that now, and we're seeing the aftermath of that, and we're seeing how all this is going to play out in a very emotional way in the weeks and months to come.
Ron Allen, thanks very much for being on top of this story for us. Appreciate it. To the pandemic now, and the new warning from the White House that we could see 100 million new infections in the fall and winter. Yes, 100 million, and if your eyeballs fell out of your head at that number, you are not alone. But here's what this is based on, right? And this is really important context, so listen up. That projection assumes that there's no extra COVID money coming from Congress for more vaccines and more treatments, okay? That's the assumption that's baked into that number. So when you hear that, you need to know that. There's also always a chance we could see some more variants. The White House is basically putting up this siren, if you will, because it wants more than $22 billion in new COVID money from Congress. They asked for that back in March. March was 2 months ago. You know, there's been this stalemate in Congress since then over this COVID cash, basically. Since then, cases have gone up. Right now, cases are up 50% in just the last couple of weeks alone. Hospitalizations are up, but deaths are down. That's obviously what officials would want to see. I want to bring in our Dr. Natalie Azar here. So, Dr. Azar, this is a warning from the White House, right? They're putting this sort of alarming sounding number paired with the, implications that is what could happen if we don't get more COVID money. Give us a gut check. How worried should we be about a fall surge?
Okay, well, I'm not necessarily going to tell you how I would rate my concern. What I would say is that everybody should be anticipating that cases will increase again in the fall. Already we have seen from the first week of April to the first week of May, we've seen a jump, Hallie, from 6 states to 24 states reporting a 50% increase in hospitalizations. We talk a lot about this uncoupling between cases and hospitalizations and deaths. Deaths we're still seeing, reasonable decline, although I think in the last 14 days the Times had it bumped up by 1%. We're so not out of the woods. And the concern here, of course, Hallie, is that by the time fall comes around, most of us who got our booster in the fall if we're not candidates for that fourth shot. So it's going to be a little bit too little too late if we're suddenly scrambling in September to get either an Omicron-specific variant vaccine ready or whatnot. All that groundwork needs to be laid now.
So this is why I think the White House, what you've laid out, Dr. Azar, is sort of sounding this alarm and saying Congress needs to do something. Congress needs to get this COVID funding out in a big way. Would another booster, would the authorization of a second booster for all of us, right, not just older people, but for the average healthy younger American adult, would that help, do you think, come, Labor Day, September, October?
Not really. And because we know that booster affords us a short-term advantage, maybe a month or two, really, of protection, Hallie, against infection before those antibodies start to decline. And to what degree there's an added benefit for an otherwise healthy person under the age of 60 in terms of preventing hospitalization, severe disease, and death, we just don't have that data. All the data that we have out of Israel on the benefit of a fourth shot really happened in older individuals who are, very vulnerable to getting very sick. So no, I don't think, boosting now is going to help us in the fall. And there's always this concern about immune fatigue and, keeping on boosting with the same ancestral strain. But, the pharma companies are studying Omicron-specific strains, bivalent with the ancestral strain plus Omicron. This needs to continue. But when the time comes and the fall comes and it's time for us all to get a booster, whether it's Omicron-specific or not, that needs to be in place. We can't play catch up. It's going to, how that happens really quickly, right? In a couple of weeks, we're already seeing the numbers increase substantially by then.
Dr. Natalie Azar, thank you. It's so important, I think, to have your perspective and your expertise with us on the show tonight on this issue. Appreciate it. Coming up, we're talking about those 3 Americans dying mysteriously while on vacation in the Bahamas. Why officials there now want the U.S. to help with the investigation into why. Plus, what we're learning about the alarming trend of guns getting stolen out of cars all across the country. After the break. Police are refusing to speculate right now on how 3 Americans died while on vacation in the Bahamas. But they're asking a lab from the U.S. to test samples from the victims to find out specifically why this might have happened. Robbie and Michael Phillips of Tennessee died Friday after getting sick at a Sandals Emerald Bay resort. Vincent Chiarella of Florida also died, while his wife, Donis, had been upgraded to fair condition at a hospital in Miami. The couples were in 2 rooms of a split villa at the resort. All 4 went to the medical facility for treatment the night before they were found unresponsive in their rooms. This is a story that's capturing the attention of people across the country. Kerry Sanders is, I think, in the Bahamas. He is. Joins us now with more. So, Kerry, update from police this afternoon. You had the chance to ask them about what some suspect might be the cause of their deaths, and it relates to the air conditioner, right?
It's not only the air conditioner, it's the hot water heating system, and it's the supply of propane. So they're looking at the beachside villa. And as you said, it's a split villa. So you have a couple on one side, a couple on the other, not necessarily, in this case, not friends, but both of the couples, all four of them, prior to this tragedy, had complained about dizziness, about some nausea. One of them playing golf was having like a little bit of a sense of like, your name again, and just sort of like that, according to witnesses. And then after playing golf, kind of like felt well again. The day before this tragedy happened, they actually had a visit by some medical officials to try to find out what was going on. They did not conclude that it was any kind of poisoning from maybe carbon monoxide, again, looking at that air conditioner and heater. But the authorities right now are looking at that on their examination of trying to find out what happened here. Hallie?
You spoke with some friends of the Phillips, right, who are understandably, I think, really just, they just seem kind of gutted by this whole thing.
You know, you come to a resort like this. We're here at Sandals. I mean, the villa we're talking about is, you know, a 2-minute walk across the beach to where I'm standing right now. And when you come on a vacation like this, people get to know each other. So they become friends during the week of their vacation, or if it's longer. In this case, we had an opportunity to speak to the Rainbolts, some folks who were visiting here, and they got to know Vince and Donis Chiarella very well. They had spent some time together, and when they found out what happened, they were, as you pointed out, they were just horrified.
Very sweet couple. Sorry. Very sweet couple. Just really good-hearted. Everybody liked to just hang out with them. They were really, really good people.
And that's kind of what happens here. You know, you're on vacation, you meet people, you become good friends, you share dinners together, you play golf together. And honestly, people come to a place like this to get away from it all. You're not stopping and thinking about some sort of danger. And remember, carbon monoxide here, it's odorless, it's colorless.
Right.
It's very hard for you, while you're on vacation even, to stop to think that that's what's going on. But even if you were at home in a regular setting, you wouldn't understand. And remember, that causes some confusion. And so it's a very hard thing for the patient to necessarily resolve. But we need to point out, the authorities are still in the midst of an investigation here. They have started the autopsies today. The toxicology tests are underway, working with a lab in Philadelphia. Plus, they say many of the experts here in the Bahamas have been trained not only in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom. So they feel very confident they are going to be able to get to the bottom of this. But right now, for the other folks who are here at the resort, there's a sense of unease because they don't have an answer, and they're wondering, even though it's appeared to be isolated in that one beachside villa, could the problem appear somewhere else?
Carrie, real quick, do we have any guidance on a timeline for when some of these results, some of these answers might start coming in?
Yeah, you know, they're working quickly, but when it comes to autopsies and toxicology, it sort of works on the speed of the lab, and the lab did not give an indication. But the authorities here in the Bahamas have been very forthright and forthcoming, saying that when they get information that they believe that they can share with the public, they absolutely will. So we will hear from them as soon as the labs give them some information.
Carrie Sanders, live for us there in the Bahamas. Carrie, thank you. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is on the verge of winning the presidency in the Philippines, the son of the country's ousted dictator. He's now on track for the biggest margin of victory in a presidential race in the Philippines since the 80s. Critics say it's bad news for democracy and human rights there. We're going to keep an eye on that. Number 2, officials in Cuba say at least 35 people were killed in last week's explosion at Havana's Hotel Saratoga. Remember, we told you about that last week. Rescue crews are still looking for anybody who might be missing in the debris of all this. You're seeing some of the video now. The hotel was getting ready to reopen after being closed for 2 years when an apparent gas leak created this blast. Number 3, more guns are being stolen out of cars all across the country, according to new data obtained by NBC News. At least 180 cities saw a rise in this kind of thing, gun thefts from cars, between 2019 and 2020. This actually, listen to this, this makes that the largest source, the biggest source of stolen guns, comes from stuff getting taken out of your car. Number 4. Federal labor officials have filed a complaint accusing Starbucks of unfair labor practice at its stores in Buffalo, New York. The complaint alleges that Starbucks was going after pro-union employees and cutting workers' pay. Starbucks says the claims are false. They'll fight them, they say, at an upcoming hearing. And number 5, a Nepali Sherpa scaled Mount Everest for a record 26th time, beating his own record last year. Kami Rita scaled the 29,000-foot mountain over the weekend, leading 10 other climbers. Officials in Nepal say the 52-year-old has a new world record now in climbing. Impressive. Still to come, an NBC News investigation reveals some new details that might have stopped, according to critics, a deadly school shooting in New Mexico before it even happened. We're going to explain. Plus, some parents are calling it a nightmare, the baby formula shortage that's probably ending up in one of your group chats. What you should know if you're struggling to find formula for your kid. Ahead. We've got some big breaking news in just the last couple of minutes here. The corrections officer and accused killer she's suspected of helping escape in Alabama are now in custody. The Lauderdale County Sheriff making the announcement not too long ago. Watch.
This is the press conference that we've been talking about all week that we wanted to call. Casey White and Vicky White are in custody.
That is an announcement, as the sheriff has alluded to, days in the making. U.S. Marshals had just released photos of that truck you just saw with pictures of Casey White in Evansville, Indiana, said to be abandoned at a car wash. Minutes later, we heard there was some kind of a chase. The sheriff saying that the two were basically chased in a black Ford F-150. Here's how he describes it. Listen.
The U.S. Marshals were in pursuit of a black Ford pickup. I think it was a F-Ford 150. Casey White was driving that vehicle. Vicky White was a passenger. During the pursuit, the pickup truck wrecked. Casey White surrendered. Vicky White has been transported to the hospital.
The sheriff did say nobody else was hurt in this chase. Said it was tips from citizens that helped get these two into custody. So again, they escaped. They were found in Indiana. They were on the run for a little more than a week. Vicky White, remember, was set to retire the very day she disappeared with Casey White. She told officers she'd been transporting White to an appointment. Vicky White, again, now in the hospital. You heard the sheriff allude to that. Both are facing some very serious charges. We heard the sheriff say of Vicky White that he hopes that she survives and says that she has some serious answers that she owes them. He also was confident that police would catch them, saying he'd never experienced a week like this in his 50 years on the job. But of Casey White, said he is not getting out of this jail again. I can assure you that, because, again, Casey White likely to be in custody at the very facility that he escaped from. We're going to have a lot more coming up on this as we get more developments on that manhunt now over. We'll be right back right after. The FDA is allowing Abbott, the company whose baby formula has been on hold since February, when there was a recall or an FDA warning. Well, they're now letting parents access this recalled product case by case. This comes at a time when a lot of families all across the country are facing this exact picture, right? Store shelves that are pretty much empty when they're trying to find formula. If they do find it, they're facing limits on how much they can buy at one time. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have been pushing the administration on how they're going to help families who need it most, with the White House press secretary promising today the FDA is working to try to fix this.
Ensuring the availability of these products is also a priority for the FDA, and they're working around the clock to address any possible shortage.
So why is formula so hard to find? And how can you get it if you need it? Here's some answers. All across the country, parents on the hunt for baby formula. Part of a nationwide shortage kicked off by supply chain issues. About 3.5 times more baby formula was out of stock late last month than it was back in November, making empty shelves kind of the new norm.
I myself am down to 1 can of formula, and I can't find his formula anywhere.
In 6 states, more than half of baby formula was totally sold out just 2 weeks ago, according to Data Assembly, which tracks the inventory at stores across the country.
A massive recall of infant formula is underway after a number of infants became ill.
Making things worse, the company behind the popular brand Similac recalled some of its formula brands in February and is still working to get operations back to normal.
I get so excited when I find 1 bottle of formula.
There are some options, like maybe buying formula online from places like Amazon, which tells NBC News they're working to keep up with demand. Walgreens and CVS have put in place a 3 formula product limit for each sale, while Target and Walmart are also limiting how much you can buy. Some parents say they're seeing a disturbing trend online.
They're going to the stores and grabbing what they can find and selling it to people that do need it for more than the double or triple the price.
The Federal Women's Infants and Children Program, known as WIC, can also help people in need find formula.
If they're a WIC participant, give us a call, kind of tell us what formula you're searching for. We've started to kind of look online at some of the stores so that families aren't driving around all over town trying to find formula.
And that's been the reality for some parents. By the way, your kid's pediatrician, like your pediatrician, also a good resource for parents who are facing a shortage. Your doctor might know, hey, here's a spot or here's something we can do. Let me bring in Dr. Kavita Patel to talk about this. Dr. Patel, we're glad to have you on. And let me start with this news that is just coming into us, actually, right as we were coming downstairs to the studio. The FDA issued this recall for Abbott products back in February over the concern about its powder and the potential risk to infants. Now the FDA is essentially, and gut check me here, but they're essentially saying, okay, on a case-by-case basis, you still may be able to use that powder, that formula, even though it's been recalled. How should we interpret this and how should we understand this?
Honestly, Hallie, it does not actually affect the majority of parents who are trying to find formula, as you highlighted. It's really meant for people who have no alternative because they have a very specialized formula that they have to get, which Similac or Abbott, the manufacturer, is one of the lone manufacturers that can provide that formula. So don't expect, thousands or tens of thousands of families to be able to get more formula. This problem is going to continue to go on. And as Jen Psaki mentioned, the key is really having the FDA work with Abbott to make sure that that Michigan plant that's basically taken down can get back to manufacturing and hopefully deal with some of the supply chain issues.
I know this, and I feel for the parents who try a lot of different things when their kids are newborns, right? Maybe their kid doesn't like this formula or that formula. They find one brand, and they're like, okay, this works. This works for our family. This works for neighbor. But at a time like this, you can't find it. You might have to switch, right? What should parents be thinking about? But, clearly, if it's a cow's milk formula versus soy milk, et cetera, right?
Right. So a couple of things. If your child, do not get tempted to dilute the formula. You might just think, I've got only enough powder for so many days. Let me put more water in there. That can cause a severe nutrition imbalance. And the American Academy of Pediatrics is actually going a step further. They have some of the resources you mentioned, but they also they said it's okay to switch formulas unless you do have one of those really specialized nutrition formulas. Again, a little more rare. And then the third thing that I've been seeing friends and people on social media talking about is actually using cow's milk, using milk or almond milk or oat milk, some sort of milk to try to advance and have milk for the toddler or for the infant. You really should avoid that at anyone less than a year old. So again, talk to the pediatrician. So these are, I feel
these are the desperate measures, Dr. Patel.
These are desperate measures. And I'll be honest with you, Hallie, this price gouging is a great example where somebody needs to intervene because that'll just continue for the near future.
Yeah, you're talking about this concerning trend online where people are, you're seeing formula for sale at like exorbitant crazy prices. Real quick, Dr. Patel, what about, I've seen this in some of the online stuff, but breast milk centers, right? Some of those places where you could get breast milk banks, for example, that could be an option for some of these parents too?
Yeah, it's a great point. Look, I had a hard time breastfeeding my children, so I would have loved to have had more options like that. And you can have a mix. So that's another area that if you don't have enough, I supplemented with formula and I was lucky to have the formula. By the way, liquid formula is also okay. So the exact thing you use in liquid form, but it's pricey. So try to search around. Healthychildren.org, American Academy of Pediatrics, a great resource for more tips.
Dr. Kavita Patel, thank you. An important conversation to have. Appreciate it. An NBC News investigation has some new details now about how some say officials missed warning signs that could have stopped a school shooting where a gunman walked into his former high school in New Mexico, killed 2 students and then himself. NBC learned that FBI agents actually visited the shooter after he posted online about going through with this whole thing. When they met with him, he apparently told them about his fascination with mass killers. But after that, the FBI decided to close the case. Writing in documents, they found no threat to the community. A year and a half later, the shooter then pretended to be a student, walked into Aztec High School, and killed students Casey Marquez and Francisco Fernandez. Marquez's mom still thinks this should never have happened. Watch.
I know she's gone. I know she's not coming back. I deal with her death every day. The circumstances leading up to her death. The people accountable for her death.
Ken Delanian has been reporting on this story for months and is joining us now. Can you explain the process here, right? When you look at what the FBI had done, what these agents have done, and then what ultimately happened?
Yeah, that's the question that drew me into this case, Hallie. And what's so unusual and even haunting about this story is that we are broadcasting and publishing experts of what I believe are the first ever audio recordings of an FBI interview with the suspect who goes on to become a school shooter. And the bottom line here is the FBI decided he was not a danger to the community, and that, in hindsight, was the wrong call. This troubled young man, here's what happened. This troubled young man had posted a disturbing threat online in 2016 saying he was plotting a mass shooting and looking for suggestions about which weapon to use. That led the FBI to send 2 agents to his home in Aztec, New Mexico. And in the interview, he made clear that he was obsessed with mass shooters and had been for years. And he told the FBI agents that he had been bullied, that he was suicidal, and that he had often posted angry and violent things online. These are all predictors of violence. But he convinced the agents that he would never actually hurt anyone, and they closed the case, saying he posed no threat to the community. And a year and a half later, he walked into his former high school and shot 2 students before turning the gun on himself, Hallie.
So what are lawmakers trying to do now to try to stop something like this from happening again? And by the way, have you gotten, like, I know you reached out to the FBI on this. What are they saying?
The FBI refused to talk to us for this story, but we talked to a former senior FBI official who reviewed the interview and said, look, there are a lot of troubling things here, but at the end of the day, this young man was not arrestable. There are a lot of people who say things but never carry out the threats, and, you know, the family profoundly disagrees with that. Look, in terms of the response nationally, there's a lot of talk about gun policy every time one of these shootings happens. But the experts I talk to say what the real issue here is we don't have a systemic approach to assessing violence, assessing people who are mentally disturbed, who are making threats online, and whether they will commit violence and getting them intervention. So in this case, you know, the FBI walked out of that house without referring that kid to counseling or anything else. The school district had suspended him from school knowing he was fascinated with the Columbine shooting, didn't tell the police about that, didn't get him any counseling. His father helped him buy a handgun a month before the shooting. So there was a collective communal failure here that resulted in violence. And what experts say is we need to have a better system of getting help, especially mental health interventions, to people who need them, Hallie.
Ken Delanian, it is an important look at, I think, an issue that has affected so many lives. And we're going to see more of that reporting from Ken. Thank you tonight on NBC Nightly News at 6:30 Eastern with Lester Holt. Don't miss it. Still ahead, California is trying to take on big business to fight plastic pollution. We'll tell you more about what they're doing in tonight's original. Now to the shocking discoveries being made at Lake Mead in Nevada. And let me just say that again, the truly shocking human remains that are being found as the water level drops because of the drought, right? One witness said they spotted a human skeleton at Lake Mead on Saturday. The medical examiner still has to determine how that person dies. And it comes just a day after a decomposed body was found in a metal barrel in the lake, in the shoreline, that again is now being exposed as the water level drops. Officials think that victim died from a gunshot between the mid-70s and the early 80s, based on an assessment of the clothes and the shoes the victim was found with. Gotti Schwartz is following this story for us tonight. It is a bit of a morbid and macabre story, Gotti, and it is a particularly vivid illustration of the impact of this drought out west.
Yeah, absolutely. And it could be the beginning of a string of cold case murder investigations as those water levels continue to drop and could expose even more secrets along these drying up shorelines. This latest discovery, as you mentioned, was of a skull and bones sticking out of the dirt. It was first spotted by some paddleboarders who were out. They saw what they thought was a rock in this area known as Colville Bay. But so far, the details are pretty scarce when it comes to how long that corpse might have been there, who it was, whether foul play was involved. And at this point, police say homicide detectives in that particular case haven't been assigned because the coroner is still working on establishing a cause of death. But in the other case that you talked about, that is being worked on by police right now. That decomposed corpse found in a corroded metal barrel that was exposed on this drying up shoreline. Police think that the person inside had been shot to death, possibly in the 70s or 80s. Hallie?
Gotti, one of the disturbing things about this is that investigators think this could keep happening. You talk about the potential for this to be the first in a string of cold cases that police are going to have to look at now.
Yeah, and investigators are saying that if these bodies were in fact from the 70s or 80s, it's basically like starting from square one. They didn't have DNA databases back then. There were undigitized or missing person reports to pour through. So it could be some time before they figure out who those people were. Hallie?
Gotti Schwartz, I'll let you go. Thank you very much for bringing us that. Appreciate it. We want to bring you tonight's original now with in-depth reporting on a topic we've been keeping an eye on. And tonight it's about plastic pollution. You had in California the state's attorney general announcing an investigation into whether Exxon has been misleading the public about how much plastic is actually recyclable. The investigation is trying to figure out, did Exxon deliberately deceive people into thinking, hey, if you recycle, we're going to solve all these problems with plastic waste? The world makes about 400 million tons of it every year, according to a UN estimate. But here in the U.S., we only recycle about 9% of our plastic, according to the EPA. Guad Venegas has the latest.
Fuel and petrochemical industries have engaged in a half-century campaign of deception.
It's an unprecedented investigation targeting an industry that includes some of the world's largest oil companies.
As part of this investigation, my office is subpoenaing ExxonMobil.
California Attorney General Rob Bonta says Exxon, the only business named so far, and other companies pushed the production of plastic products while misleading the public about the damage caused to the environment and exaggerate the benefits of recycling.
The truth is, the vast majority of plastic products, by design, cannot be recycled, and 91% end up in landfills, are burned, or are released into the environment.
ExxonMobil rejects the allegations, stating they are collaborating with governments and communities to improve waste management, adding their technology converts a broad range of used plastics to raw material. As the world trades gasoline vehicles for electric ones, plastic production is another way for oil companies to make profits.
You actually have all these oil companies telling their shareholders that increased demand for plastic is going to make up the difference and actually allow them to keep growing and drilling for more oil and fracking for more gas.
It's estimated in February of this year alone, 7.3 billion pounds of plastic were produced in North America. That's roughly the weight of 10 Empire State Buildings.
The plastics industry, the petrochemical industry, the fossil fuel industry are bullish on producing more and more plastics, ever more plastics.
And the trash buildup is undeniable. A report from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation estimates by 2050, the mass of plastic in the ocean could outweigh all the fish in the water.
What is the best action to take?
A lot of people are investing a ton of time and money into trying to clean up the material that's already out in the ocean, to clean up the existing mess that's out there. And that might be part of the solution, but really it's like cleaning up a spill without turning off the tap. And frankly, the water's coming out a lot faster than we're wiping it up.
And the Attorney General says it's now making its way into our bodies.
Plastic pollution is hurting our health. We consume a credit card's worth of plastic every week. Plastic breaks down and it's in the food we eat and the fluid that we drink.
As the probe in California continues, local governments around the country are taking action. More cities now banning single-use plastics. The goal? To encourage a shift to reusable materials and limit the production of plastic around the world before we drown ourselves with its pollution.
Guad Venegas is joining us now. Guad, we're glad to have you with us. You've talked about, and you just mentioned it there, people over the country trying to fight this. How and what's next?
Hallie, well, California is one of the most progressive places when it comes to changing the rules, right? So you have cities like San Francisco, San Diego, now even Los Angeles, put ordinances in place to ban things like polystyrene and, of course, like we mentioned, the single-use plastics. Statewide, now there's new legislation that's forcing restaurants to ask customers if they want utensils to go when they buy food. Things like these are changing behavior. You look at, like, the plastic bags in stores that are no longer being offered across the country. That's forcing people to bring in reusable bags when they go shopping or to just carry the product. So this is why experts say there has to be new legislation to decrease the demand and production of plastic so that ultimately consumers will change the way we all behave. Hallie.
Guad, great to have you with us from LA. Appreciate it. After the break, we're hearing from an accuser in the sexual misconduct trial against Mario Batali. What the alleged victim said about the celebrity chef in court. That's next. Celebrity chef Mario Batali in a Boston courtroom today, where a woman, Natalie Teeny, says she wants Batali to be held accountable for his actions for allegedly groping and kissing her at a restaurant in 2017. Teeny saying he was, quote, wasted, and that she felt shocked and powerless to do anything to try and stop him. You are looking at our first images that we've seen of Batali in court. His lawyer says it never happened. Her testimony came after Batali decided to have a judge, not a jury, decide whether he's guilty or not. He has pleaded not guilty, but if convicted, he could be looking at 2.5 years behind bars, and he'd have to register as a sex offender. This whole thing stems from an incident where Teenie says Batali noticed her taking photos of him at a restaurant and asked her to take one together, after which she says he touched and kissed her without her consent. 4 other women also accused him of inappropriate touching, which led to him stepping down from his huge restaurant empire. Just last year, Batali also paid $600,000 in an investigation by the New York Attorney General's office into allegations he and other workers sexually harassed employees. Joyce Vance joins us now. And Joyce, let me start with something that I mentioned, which is Batali made this decision not to have a jury decide his fate, but a judge here. What would be the thinking behind this?
Typically, you see a defendant do that when they believe they've got a case that's unappealing on the facts, where the jury might be inflamed by prejudice or emotion, but the defendant believes that they have technical legal arguments that they can make that will convince a judge that they shouldn't be convicted. That's very likely the reason for this sort of a decision in this prosecution.
When we heard from Batali's accuser, she was recalling a pretty specific detail, which she says happened. If you're somebody advising Batali on this, right? If you're Batali's attorneys, how do you they're not cross-examine, that's not the right word, but how do you combat that perception that she is putting down?
Well, cross-examination is a good place to start, but this is on a knife's edge for a defendant, because when a victim comes off as sympathetic in front of a jury, and very often they do, if the defense pushes too hard on cross-examination, then they run the risk of alienating the jury. But in this case, the entire strategy the defense is using is to say that the victim here has made it up, that she's not being truthful, and to paint her as someone who's opportunistic. You know, her recollection is very specific and very detailed, and that doesn't always mean that a witness is telling the truth, but that's how our system works. We leave these determinations about witness credibility up to juries, and that's where this will ultimately be decided.
If you are, I want to remind people, too, the moment that we were in sort of as a country, the era, this Me Too era, right? And Batali was one of several restaurateurs who was hit by these accusations of sexual assault coming from multiple women, for example. What are you looking for? Like, as you look ahead to the rest of this trial of a high-profile man involved in this harassment case, what else will you be looking for, and what should we be thinking about here?
So of all of the women who accused him of misconduct, this is the only case that's proceeded to a criminal prosecution so far. And the baseline issue here, and this is likely the reason that he's sought to have the case decided by a jury, is whether he will put on a case in his own defense, even perhaps take the witness stand, or whether the argument will be the prosecution bears the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and they simply haven't met it here. And this is the kind of argument that a defendant can sometimes make successfully in a case that comes down to being a he said, she said. She says he did this, he says he didn't, and the defense will likely tell the judge that they believe that the defendant should be acquitted because of the failure of the burden of proof. So something to look for here is whether Batali actually takes the witness stand. If he does, it may be an indication that they believe he's in trouble, and that's the only way he can be acquitted. But it's, typically we don't see defendants testify in cases like this. It can be, quite a double-edged sword.
Joyce Vance, thank you very much. Appreciate you being with us. Appreciate all of you joining us for another hour here of the show on NBC News Now. We're going to have more for you here tomorrow, same time, same place. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.